In this lecture, we will look at the phenomenon known as urbanization. In World Resources, A Guide to the Global Environment, 1996 to 1997. The authors describe one of the most significant developments in human society. The world is in the midst of massive urban transition unlike that of any other time in history. Within the next decade, more than half of the world's population, an estimated 3.3 billion, will be living in urban areas. A change with vast implications, both for human well-being and for the environment. As recently as 1975, just over one-third of the world's people lived in urban areas. By 2025, the proportion will have risen to almost two-thirds. Why is it that such a large population of the Earth's population has chosen urban life over rural life, and why is it increasing so rapidly? In Chapter 13, we'll look at how the city is a community in cooperation. Chapter 14 discusses how the megacity is out of control. And finally, Chapter 15 is about making cities work. Let's begin by looking at how the city is a community in cooperation. It all began thousands of years ago when humans lived together in groups. Many groups were nomadic, and they moved as the seasons and food's needs demanded. The Mi'kmaq were such a migrating community. They lived as extended families. They hunted prey and gathered food. Living together provided better protection for everyone in the group. They followed routes. In midsummer, they lived by the ocean and dug clams. In the fall, they fished for salmon. In the winter, they lived in the relative warmth of the woods. As populations grew, the amount of contact and conflict grew. Often it came down to choices. A. Give up the land. B. Fight for your rights to the land. C. Join the dominant tribe. D. When groups were too large and the nearby lands were already occupied, that's when the nomadic life came to an end and agricultural life started. The first villages were stable locations. There was a source of food. In the villages, other activities beside food started. There were weapon makers and spiritual leaders. They would exchange their services for food and trade. The village started the dependence on the cooperation among unrelated members. Villages grew more specialized. Trade began eventually between villages, and communities started to depend on one another. Intra- and inter-village trade created a new profession in the buying and selling of goods. The trader was the go-between. Gradually, this activity developed to such an extent that whole new communities were set up for trade. These new trading centers allowed distant villages to make just one trip to the trading center rather than trips to each village. Nomadic people chose a site because it was near a resource, whether it was food to preserve for winter or bark for making canoes. A lack of firewood, water, or protection was not as important because next season the group would take more care to find a better site. Farmers developed permanent communities where site characteristics were very important. In good water supply, fertile soil, minerals, flat land, and a moderate climate. After inter-village trading began, siting a village had to be within walking distance. Villages didn't have to locate near a valuable resource. Instead, it was how far they were from trading partners and the transportation route that was important. Before vehicles, the rivers provided the main means of transportation in and out of the interior of the continent. As such, many communities developed on river banks. Settlers had fresh water for drinking and watering crops. Transportation was always nearby. Some acquires land by coastal and river sites, as was the case of Rotterdam, Holland. Sites along two merging rivers were also ideal trading villages. Winnipeg was founded on the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers. Many cities are on large islands in rivers, or a meander site on oxbow rivers, because land is fertile but prone to flooding. Lumbering, mining, fishing, and mill towns developed where people could be near a resource. Hydropower was the reason for developing mill towns. Ottawa was downriver of forestry activity, and the river provided a cheap way to move the logs downstream to the mill. Mineral resources were the reason for Sudbury to develop. Natural beauty was the reason for the tourism vacation town of Banff. Waterfalls on a river created what we call a head of navigation site. The waterfall created an obstacle for shipping, and that required a change in transportation for ships and barges to land transport. Montreal is the example of this. Some communities do well because of their location rather than their inherent site characteristics. Proximity to borders is one reason for a town. In Mexico, just across from the United States, are located the Maquiladora. These are factories controlled by multinationals that are taking advantage of cheap labor and lax environmental regulations. The distance from the border may be the reason for national's capital, as inland cities are easier to defend. Ottawa was chosen as Canada's capital rather than Toronto or Kingston because Ottawa is further away from the U.S. border. Proximity to serviced communities is a reason used in the prairies to cite the location of grain elevators. The elevators were placed at a regular distance from each other to ensure the easy access to all the grain farmers. Site modification may be necessary if the site for settlement lacks some of the required characteristics. New Orleans had to build levees to keep the flood waters out of the city. Situation modification occurred in Ottawa. Ottawa business people were losing trade because Ottawa was not on the major trade routes of the Great Lakes. So they built the Rideau Canal from Lake Ontario to Ottawa to bring the ships to them.